Okay, so welcome back to day 7 of the Eurac Summer School Research Program. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Leiza Brumat, who is a senior research fellow here at Eurac Research and also associated with the United Nations University. She gave a talk today on the South American Regional Migration System, so I'm very glad to have you here today to ask a few more questions and get a little bit more context on your thoughts about that. So, for those who weren't there today, could you give me a brief overview of the South American Regional Migration System and maybe just briefly talk about how it works, some of the principles, and maybe how it compares to the EU?
Okay, so when we talk about migration system, we talk about flows and which are the main patterns that govern human mobility in a certain region. So most migration in this regard in South America, the main pattern in South America is intra-regional. So most migration in South America, around 70%, is intra-regional. South Americans moving to other South American countries. That said, regional, extra-regional migration towards other countries outside of the region towards North America is currently, it had a peak in the 1990s and especially in the early 2000s, but now it decreased, and because of Venezuelan large-scale displacement, intra-regional migration is again the prevailing pattern. And migration from other regions of the world, unlike the European Union, from extra-regional countries like coming from Africa or from North America to South America is very low. So that's another difference. The South American, if we want to talk about South American migration governance, it is governed at the regional level by two main norms. One is the Residence Agreement of Mercosur, which provides a free right to residence for all South American nationals, more or less, and the Cartagena Agreement for refugee and asylum. And this system is, well, this general regional norms are very different from the EU ones, because in South America there is no free movement regime like in the European Union. There are norms that liberalize mobility across borders. In some countries, some borders more than others. And there is a regional right to residence, which is very different and it works differently from the EU one, especially because it is not tied to the existence of the common market. It is tied to other factors,
Right.
such as irregular mobility, irregular border crossings, for instance, or irregular migration, and trying to solve that via regularization.
Right. Thank you. I've got a lot of questions because this topic interests me as well. So for my first question, during your talk, you mentioned that the South American migration governance regime differs slightly from the EU in that the South American nations consider working together and cooperative methods regarding migration and other things to be a method of actually boosting their sovereignty. Whereas in the EU context, generally integrative methods are seen as requiring the relinquishing of certain elements of sovereignty, usually over like economic regulations or migration policies in the effort of creating a common market or a common federation. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on this sort of paradoxical, at least in my opinion, approach to sovereignty, how working together actually builds sovereignty. How does that work in the South American context?
Well, for instance, we know that there is the Organization of American States, the OAS, and the US is part of the OAS, right? So a lot of the regional integration efforts that have been done in South America, especially in the 2000s, like UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, was a direct response to the OAS. The UNASUR actually developed a lot of regional institutions and mechanisms to avoid the OAS from interfering, from applying its norms and institutions to South America. One example is not only migration, it's democracy protection or the control of the monitoring of elections. So UNASUR, for instance, at some point developed its own mechanism for monitoring elections, independent from the OAS ones, just to prevent the interference of the US. So autonomy, sovereignty enhancing, that's the idea.
Interesting.
We developed our own thing to keep the other one out.
No, yeah, that makes sense, particularly when you consider the history of like the Monroe Doctrine and various different things.
When
like
you go
that.
to history.
Yeah, when you go to history,
it makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. My second question would be, so the South American migrational system, you talk about as being one of the most progressive in the world. And at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that South America, or Latin America more broadly, has a common or very similar culture, language, and like history of colonialism and a variety of other things like that. So I wonder to what extent this progressive approach to migration can work in when applied to extra regional migration. For example, in your presentation, you gave an example of a South American critique of the EU system as being xenophobic or very closed to outsiders. And we've seen that in the EU, for example, the Syrian crisis, the EU was able to accept significant numbers of Ukrainian migrants, but there was a far bigger deal to accept Syrian migrants because of differences of culture, and it's an extra regional migration. So I'm wondering to what extent the South American policy works because of this common culture, this common language, a sense of solidarity perhaps, and if this can be applied to instances where the migration is between regions.
Well, I believe that there are cultural and linguistic factors that enable cooperation, but that's not the whole story. I mean, it plays out, it does have an impact, but there are many other factors that have an impact on regional cooperation. Because let's think about Europe again. Okay, Europe free movement was inspired by economic integration, and that was the driving force. But we're talking about countries with very strong differences in some aspects, like linguistically speaking, all the languages are different. So, I mean, intra-regional mobility is actually more difficult for that reason. So, language and cultural similarities are not the whole story. There are many other factors. And here we have to look at state preferences and interdependencies, and which type of interdependencies there are between states, and which are the domestic preferences of each state that are created by its own capacities or lack of them. So all this progressiveness in South America builds from different factors. One of them is a history that is deeply related to the development of a human rights regional and domestic regime and legislation. So there's a lot of legislation on human rights and the development of human rights that comes from dictatorships, and having a very deep and difficult story with dictatorships. So as a response to all these stories with the dictatorships, there are the human rights regime in South America, and some countries in particular, like Brazil and Argentina, is very much developed. So it builds from this strong human rights legislation and movement. Many of the bureaucrats within the South American states are socialized around these human rights ideas and legislation, and these people actually process bureaucracy or make decisions within the bureaucracy, and they have this influence in mind. So that's one reason, the built-in capacities that are related to this, plus this long story, plus the fact that there are difficulties for regularizing all the migrants, and because of this state capacities limitation, there's a strong push for seeking ways to solve it, and these solutions are regularization. So there's a different mindset. I don't know if the South American regional migration regime can be actually exported, but what I do think, because I think that every context is very particular, but what I do think is that us as migration scholars and as international relations, sociology, social sciences scholars, it's necessary for us to know how decisions are made in other parts of the world. What are the ideas that govern decision making, policy making and policy implementation in different regions of the world, because we may find out that we can think differently. We may not be able to apply the same solutions, and I think that transposing one solution to the other, from one place to the other, is not really feasible, but we can think about different ways of acting, different ways of thinking, and that's already useful. At least it could help us to think about different policy solutions that can be adapted to our regional context.
That's a good point. This has been a very interesting presentation for me, yours specifically, because coming from the American context, I haven't really interacted much with the South American conception of migration and how it should be controlled and integrated and governed and so on and so forth. So I really appreciate you giving this talk and for agreeing to this conversation with me, because I had to cut down the number of questions that I had to just go for these ones. But I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us here at the Eurac Summer Institute, and hope you'll join us again next time. Dr. Brumat, thank you very much.
Thanks to you.